Hello, Obooters from around the world. My name is Kais, and I am 12 years old, and I live in Montreal, Canada. Welcome to our Oboot Zoom session, where me and my co-host Amena, who is also 12 years old and lives in Montreal, will be interviewing our guest changemaker, Sarah Sachs. Sarah is based in New York. She's a principal at Buro Happold, an engineering firm that designs buildings and city solutions for an ever-changing world. Sarah's work links several sustainable development goals, especially to goal number 11, sustainable cities and communities, and goal number 13, climate action. Anna and I will ask questions to Sarah about her background, her journey, her work, her skills, and her impact. We hope that you'll enjoy the session. Now start with my first question to our guest. Can you please tell us a little bit about you and what you do for your work? Please.
Right, well, thank you guys for having me on what is a rainy day in Brooklyn, New York. My name is Sarah Sachs. I'm a principal at Buro Happold Engineering, and so that's an international engineering company that started in Bath, England, in the UK, and has pretty much expanded globally. So I work in the New York office, and I've pretty much had my entire career at Buro Happold. My background and training was in mechanical engineering. I studied at Cooper Union in New York City, originally thinking I wanted to be an architect because I just was really interested in the creation of homes and buildings and spaces and the way in which a space could kind of impact your life in many different ways, even down to like your mood. And my father was a New York City historian. So I had all this intention to study engineering at Cooper Union and then get a master's in architecture and go off on my way and be an architect. But I got a job right outside of my undergraduate degree, and I was introduced to this thing called sustainability, which I was not introduced to at all in my schooling. My schooling was really strict fundamentals. There was no discussion of climate change. There was no discussion of integrated design or even architectural engineering because of the program that I was in. And it hooked me. I really love the idea that there was an opportunity to apply this very strict technical discipline in mechanical engineering through this kind of triple bottom line lens of environmental, social, and economic functions to have a positive impact on what it is that we build and design. And I kind of stayed with that as the industry has changed and evolved. So I focus a lot on building buildings or consulting on buildings and spaces in the public realm. So both within higher education and museums and parks. And I focus on looking at promoting integrated design and looking at the impact that these buildings and spaces have on the environment and the cities with which they are being constructed and the people therein. That was a long-winded answer.
Amina, you can ask the next question now.
Okay. What are the most complex projects the company undertook?
That's a tricky one. I'll say that one of the most complex projects that I've personally been involved in is the renovation and the expansion for the American Museum of Natural History on the Upper West Side in New York City. And the reason it was, or it has been, one of the most challenging projects is that, one, I'm working with an existing building that is landmarked. So that means it has historical significance, at least for a majority of it. And so there are lots of rules and regulations between what you can and cannot do as it relates to modifying that. Two, there's the complexity of having this pre-existing building and fitting in the new building that will work with it, both programmatically in terms of being able to enhance what they want to do within the building, as well as aesthetically. So with those limitations in mind, we were also given the goal to make it extremely sustainable. So there were challenges within figuring out architecture and design and systems to reduce energy use and water use. At the same time, they wanted to keep the rest of the museum and all the laboratories and adjacent spaces in operation through construction. So we also had to think about not the end goal of the new project, but all the steps in between and how to move people from point A to point B, or renovations that needed to be made in order to allow research and development to go on for the 3 or 4 years during construction. So I would say within all of that, that was probably one of the most challenging projects that I've been involved in my career.
All right, so what makes a building sustainable?
What makes a building sustainable? I think it's a mix of things. On the building performance side of things, as it relates to utilities and utility bills, it's a building that has a reduction in energy use as compared to a typical construction. And I would say a super sustainable or extremely high performance building, in some senses, might even generate more energy on site, or the amount of energy on site that it actually utilizes. A sustainable building is also keeps conservation of water in mind and might apply technologies like collection of rainwater and reuse of rainwater or toilet flushing water for reuse on property. Those are kind of the easy ones. They're technical engineering challenges, but there's known technologies and kind of a known procedure and path and way of applying that. There's other aspects of sustainability that we're really focused on, particularly in light of the pandemic, and that has to do with health and well-being and productivity. So a sustainable building is one that hopefully has a positive impact on the people that are in there. So that's an improved amount of air quality, that's access to things like daylight and views, and it's the creation of a space that can be inspiring or that can be comfortable to work in or to study in. It's a space that has good acoustics. So the acoustics, it's not too noisy and it's not too quiet. And it allows you to focus and do the work that you need to do. I would say a sustainable building is also one that's inclusive, that is designed for access for all, for the able and the less so. So I would say a lot of that all comes into mind when you're thinking about defining a sustainable building.
Okay. What is the main part of your job?
I look at a lot of spreadsheets now as the main part of my job. The main part of my job right now as a principal is that I direct a larger team of interdisciplinary engineers working on a project. So in a sense, I'm a bit of a conductor in making sure that different people are speaking to each other at the right stage in design. So when we work on defining sustainability, or sometimes we call it integrated design, it means that you're not doing your work in a silo. It's not just mechanical engineers thinking about mechanical engineering things, and a building enclosure designer thinking about building enclosure, and an architect thinking about architecture. But it's rather looking at the synthesis of all those pieces to try to make something that is higher performing because of the way in which it works together. So I go to a lot of meetings and workshops with architects and clients, and most importantly, the end user. I think it's really important to understand who we're designing a building for and who those end users are, to see if there's changes in the way in which there's a desire for the use of a space. And there's a lot of calculations that go along with it. We have a much more robust team of analysts that do calculations that predict the amount of annual energy a building would do, or they do engineering drawings and documents. And then there's oversight all the way through construction, down to what we call a soft landing, or it's a post-occupancy evaluation. So it's we spend all this time in a virtual world, calculating and designing in the ether, using engineering fundamentals and analytics and visualization. Then you complete a project. But then there's the curiosity and closing the loop of, is it actually performing the way in which it's intended? Is it meeting temperature set points and comfort that you expected? Are the acoustics as you expected? Is the energy as you expected? And if it's not, it's figuring out why and how can we make it better.
So, what's your favorite part about your work?
I love architecture and design, and I love meeting different people. And I also really love to travel. So I've pretty much spent my entire life in New York City. And it's been, there's great education programs in New York City. There's also incredible architecture in New York City, and it's a hub for design. So I've enjoyed building, we also have a lot of airports. I've enjoyed building my career in New York, but working on projects elsewhere and really getting to know the city or the town or the region with which I'm designing, and working on having an influence there. And it's been interesting as my career has changed, and also our focus on sustainability has changed in terms of the necessity of travel, and the carbon impact of travel, and how much we can actually do remotely effectively in a good way, and how much there's still the real value of getting to know a new place.
What are your projects/goals for the future?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
What are your projects/goals for the future?
Projects less goals?
/ goals.
Like a slash.
Oh, slash, sorry. I think we've got a mission at Buro Happold really thinking about innovation to look at being net zero carbon in both our projects and our own operations. And I think that's actually a shorter term goal. That's a 3 to 5 year goal of looking at the kind of work that we do, how we deliver the work, how we change the way we design, and really rethinking our client base. Because we think that society, and setting ourselves as an example, we have to adapt to the reality of climate change, and we need to walk the walk and talk the talk. And perhaps it's not necessarily a client goal to be net zero carbon, but that's our personal design goal. So I would love to see that every project that Buro Happold is engaged in delivers that, regardless of whether or not that's what the client is asking for.
So, if there is a way that COVID affected your work, how did it?
COVID's had an enormous impact on the personal way in which I'm doing my work, which is at home. And I was very used to working face to face with people, and understanding the kind of translation to video-based communication from face-to-face based communication has been a really different way. And we're doing a lot more emailing as well, and Skyping and texting based comms than we had done historically. So that's been a transition. And I think what we've found in our business is there's a lot of things that we can do a lot more efficiently and effectively, remotely or purely digitally. And there are other things that were not as effective, and I think we'd want to spend more time in focusing on face to face for the things where that really matters, and more time remotely and effectively in improving our use of things like technology that can kind of enhance our productivity on others. I personally have also really, it's been a very scary year, but a bit of a blessing in disguise, enjoyed having more time with my family day to day. And looking at the nature of business, which I think is changing. And I think the engineering and architecture business is going to move more towards a flexible working environment, where you can get your job done remotely at times. It's not going, I don't think it's going to be a return to the 40-hour in the office, same time every day commute work life. It also made us really rethink the public realm and the space for what I enjoy personally, and also the way cities. There's been an increased value to spaces where you can open the window, and that's natural ventilation, and that's a sustainable strategy that many people don't consider. Or buildings and spaces that have outdoor spaces that are well lit, that have Wi-Fi, that are mic, where you can have the value of outdoor classrooms or outdoor dining, which has been enormous in New York. And I think there's going to be a tremendous move to rethinking the public realm and what is valuable, and how urban planning and design starts to respond to that.
Is there anything you dislike about your job?
Spreadsheets. I mean, every job has its own challenges. You can have really stressful days. Like, I work on more than one project at a time, and when deadlines overlap at the same time, it can be very stressful. And that's kind of the push and pull of working, at least in my industry, in the construction industry. There's the stress on time too. A lot of the stuff that I love to do is creative thinking, but often when you've got a lot of constraints on your own schedule and you've got pressured time, like this designated time I'm going to be creative, and you don't feel particularly creative, can be a challenge. But I've spent my entire career in the built environment, and there's something about it that I really love, and it's changed. And I'm really excited that there seems to be, an increased focus on designing to mitigate climate change. I met Reem through, we were both specialist consultants in sustainability in an engineering company. And we were a specialized group that looked at this stuff. And now everything is changing, where certain things are mandatory, codes are changing, where consulting to cities that are changing the way in which they're thinking, and we're watching the market transform. So I think, the occasional frustration or stress that's just related to time management is well worth the satisfaction that I have in my career.
All right, so is this what you imagined to do when you were a kid?
No, not at all. I didn't know anything about sustainability. Like, my favorite book growing up, or one of the ones that I remembered, was this was a picture book called Build Me a House, Miss Mouse. And Miss Mouse was an architect, and she designed vernacular architectural homes for all the other animals. So vernacular architecture is architecture of the place. So it was like a tree house for a squirrel, and it was like a coral house for a fish, and it was these like very detailed cutaways of their home. So I did have this idea that I loved, like, to draw, and the idea of creating a home for someone. And then I understood that could be architecture. But I never thought I was going to be an engineer, and nor did I think that I was going to be talking about things like carbon emissions. Like, that just wasn't on my radar. But as the industry changed, and the language has evolved and the focus has evolved, I love that what I've studied can contribute to having a positive impact on the world.
What's the biggest challenge your company faces?
I think there's a challenge with our size and scale. So we're around 1,500 people internationally, and there's a lot of diversity there, which I think that can really enrich things. But I think one of our biggest challenges is how, if we are to grow, how are we going to grow effectively and efficiently while still maintaining the level of community engagement, and ensuring that there's kind of a consistency through the vision and passion and goals of the company. And the reason why I'm at a place like Buro Happold, I'd like to see that resonate everywhere you are, even though it could certainly be different for different people. But as you know, cultures are different, and scales are different, and markets are different, and people are different. You know, it can start to change. So I think that's one of our biggest challenges, and particularly if we have like enormous performance commitments as it relates to carbon emissions operationally and design by. And we have to all get on board in order to do so. And leadership is now on board, which is great.
All right. What would be a dream project for you to work on?
I'm very interested in continuing to work on projects that take on the living building challenge. And I don't know if you guys have learned about that in your classes. It's a form of a certification for a building that looks at the full life cycle of the project. So it's net zero energy. That means it generates as much energy as it uses, or is even net positive energy. It's net zero carbon, and it looks into the embodied carbon of the elements that it's used to even construct and operate the building. It's net zero water, so it's collecting or filtering and reusing the same amount of water that it needs. It has a sense of place, it has a sense of beauty, and it's creating these not so lofty anymore, but these relatively lofty goals of performance in a holistic manner that really requires the buy-in from the owner. I would like to do more projects like that. I have one right now, but I would like, you know, all my projects to be like that.
All right.
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I'd like to see myself as a partner in the company, and I'd like to see myself running a larger team of people that focus on these types of projects that have these specialties. I'd like to see more women in STEM and women in leadership in my company. We're making short change. I'd like to see more diversity within our staff, and I'd like to see more inclusion, both from junior staff up through leadership. So I think in 5 years, I'd like to see a bit of a change in the faces of leadership and the group with which I'm working with.
All right. So you studied two different things, architecture and engineering. Was it hard doing that, studying two different things?
So I never studied architecture. I planned on it, and I never went back to school. So I studied engineering, and it was a challenge, particularly my first 2 years of engineering, because it was all fundamentals. And I think this is just the way my brain works, is things didn't really start to click for me until I was applying it to very specific projects and capstone projects. So the base core classes didn't hold my attention as well until I was in kind of labs and studios where I was applying that knowledge. Now I completely understand why the curricula was set up the way in which it was, but I wasn't really quite sure whether or not I liked engineering my first years. And it was my second 2 years of higher ed that really kind of sparked for me. And architecture studies is quite a challenge, and the studio is quite a challenge. And I only have insight into that because it's funny, I never got an architecture degree, but I've done all of my teaching at architecture schools. So I teach fundamentals of sustainability and engineering design to architectural studios. And I'm glad I took the path that I took. I think also as a consultant, I have a wider reach on projects and people, because I work with many different architects and many different designers and many more different clients than I otherwise would if I was in one architecture firm that did a certain type of work. I don't know if that answered the question, but
it did. Oh, by the way, Amena, this is going to be your last question because we don't have that much time.
Okay, last question. What inspired you to work in this field?
I think it was this like real interest in buildings and cities. So I grew up in Staten Island, which is part of New York City, and it's one of the boroughs. It's the most suburban borough. It's the one that you reach Manhattan by ferry. And there's always a bit of kind of Oz or Gotham. We would refer to Manhattan as the city growing up. And I always liked the energy and the vibe that this place had, and it was both by nature of the people that it drew into it and the kind of structures that created that, and the parks and the waterfront and the lake. So I think that like the idea that you could create I was very strong in maths and sciences, and the idea that you could create a career out of being involved and engaged in that seemed really quite interesting to me, even though, you know, my parents weren't builders or engineers or anything like that. Funny thing is, my brother and I are both engineers. I kind of became an architectural / sustainability engineer, and my brother became a recording engineer. So we like to joke that we've picked an engineering path that has very, very strong synergies with the arts.
All right, so before we end our interview, I have one last question for you, Sarah. Do you have any advice for a young person who wants to become an engineer or an architect?
Yes, there are a lot of programs, I think, that out there in municipalities that provide mentorship programs and insight into the architecture, engineering, and construction field. In the United States, there's a program called ACE. We've seen a number of different ones regionally. And if there is anything like this, and some of them are now actually being performed entirely virtually over the last year because of COVID, so it's not as geographically focused. If there's an opportunity to do, you know, a weekend intensive or get an internship or be involved in, you know, during your, during the academic calendar in some of these mentoring or STEM type programs, I really recommend it. So it's a way of trying it out that's low risk, that gives you insight into various, you know, options and opportunities within the industry. But also, you also meet other like-minded students that, you know, could be interested in that too. The thing I went to the ACE program in high school. The thing I really liked about it is I met some kids that just wanted to be totally into construction, and then there are other people that are really into architecture. But for me, it gave me a definition of what engineering was. Not sustainable engineering, but what engineering was, which I wouldn't otherwise have known. It looked good on the college application too, but I had fun doing it.
All right, so thank you, Sarah and Amena, for the great discussion and for everything that we learned today. Thank you, Oboot, for listening to this interview. Make sure to follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can hear about upcoming sessions with other changemakers. Please also tell your friends about Oboot and share social media links with them. And last but not least, go to oboot.co to learn about opportunities to collect digital badges and help us jot down carbon.